Welcome to the Fermynwoods Contemporary Art Podcast, guest curated and presented by SUBTERRA. I am your host and one half of SUBTERRA, Marie-Chantal Hamrock. We invite you to get lost in the unknown as we take a stroll through rich woodlands, dark forests, and subterrestrial landscapes. As we navigate these eerie and unfamiliar spaces, we will explore artist talks, discussions, and original commissioned sound art. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another xylophobia-themed episode of the podcast. This episode is a little different from the previous ones Astrid and I have curated. This time we cracked open a beer, or in Johannes' case a cup of tea, and discussed the works that Treacy and Johannes Zits produced for the Treewilder exhibition at Barnwell Park. Treewilder is an exhibition of site-responsive interventions, sculptures, and video work set in Barnwell Country Park, aiming to encourage visitors to explore the woodland space throughout autumn and winter. Treacy is interested in territories where people gather because there is nowhere else to go, where communities exist in a fragile state as a result of social exclusion. Often, these places are overlooked and not perceived to have a positive function, yet through human interaction and intervention, act as a collective for those who are dislocated or marginalized. Using photogrammetry, a photographic process that uses powerful software to stitch together two-dimensional photographs in 3 dimensions, Danny captured signs of affection and devotion from social rituals that have taken place at Barnwell, displaying the photographic prints in the shelters around the park. And, infiltrating the annual burning ritual in the park, he also added parts retrieved from abandoned motorbikes to the fire to reform the molten metal into an ambiguous trophy. On the other hand, Johannes Zits' multidisciplinary practice focuses on the many meanings engendered by a body, both human and non-human, extending the notion of the performer to include nature itself. During a residency at Barnwell Park in autumn 2022, Johannes guided local participants through a series of actions and exercises to develop an intuitive durational performance with a group of birch trees. Moving as a group with the goal of staying connected to one another, as humans and to the rest of the non-human world, participants aimed to stay in the moment, acknowledging what was in front of them with respect. A pioneer tree species with a typical lifespan comparable to humans themselves, slowly converting areas into more established woodlands. It has been suggested that Danny might represent the dark whilst Johannes might represent the light, but through the following conversation, both artists reveal how such binary oppositions might in fact not be the case, and the works coalesce and converge, meeting at what is perhaps the most intriguing uniting theme: joy. Welcome both of you so much to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you both here and to talk about your work. And it's nice to be ending the day for us, well, for me and Danny, with a drink. But obviously, Johannes, it's 4 p.m. for you, right? So a tea.
Yeah.
I really wanted to wait till the recording started to do this.
When I was invited to take part in the show, it was based on the idea that I would be responding to the space directly, in a very similar way to Johannes, I guess, in that the actual park itself, where the exhibition took place, is the space that where the material came from in terms of the work that was exhibited. So I arranged a couple of visits over the summer, late summer, and I just kind of spent some time in the woodland area of that park, and sort of continued a vein I've been going down over the last couple of years of looking for and recording marks that were made on trees by by anonymous people, basically, and using a sort of process, a photographic process that creates a digital image. It's called photogrammetry, and it's basically the reason why I use it is because it records the marks made on trees, these carvings. They're actually called arboglyphs. They've got this like official name. So it's literally the sort of like the marks that are made on trees. But the reason I use this process, photogrammetry, is because it fragments the woods, and it removes the marks in a way that is very, very successful for me anyway, because it literally sort of extrapolates this information in a way that is really interesting for me. So that was one aspect of it, and then another aspect was to work with
Danny, Could I just interrupt?
Yeah, sure.
The way it interpolates, would you say it makes it less personal?
I'm not sure about. I don't know about less personal. I think it just makes it. It isolates it in a way that I found previously when working in a space such as the woods, that there's that saying, you can't see the wood for the trees. And it kind of feels a lot like that. It's very hard to find a vision in a space that's like a dense wood, because of the number of trees. And the thing that this technology does really well is when it fails, it sort of fragments and it breaks down. And in doing that, it really isolates just these tiny marks that you might not necessarily see or notice. And it really sort of like highlights them and brings them out in a way that for me is really successful, because ultimately what I'm trying to do is to bring our attention onto these marks that we might notice, but we tend to dismiss, because there's an element ultimately of mark making in the woodland space that is similar to the process that we know as graffiti, where we're sort of leaving marks in a space. And there's some kind of a dismissal of this, ultimately because I guess it's partly an illicit act. I mean, I'm not sure to the exact extent of how bad this is for a tree. I know that it doesn't kill the tree, of course. It's a bit like us getting a scar on our bodies, basically. The tree heals. As a case in point, one of the bits of woodland where I make work, I came across a mark on a tree that said Jubilee or Jubilee year 18 something or other, and it was like clearly Queen Victoria's Jubilee, and it's still there, still visible. I didn't record that one because it was just not that relevant, but it's just this idea that the damage occurs, I think isn't totally authentic. I think there are ways to really damage a tree, but you have to do it in a different way. This is more just like mark making ultimately, and it tends to be kind of undervalued because of that confusion about what actually happens to the tree, the damage that's inflicted on the tree. I think it's generally frowned upon, but actually I think it's something really important about the fact that I'm bringing the attention to this act of ultimately, usually two people engaged in some kind of a romantic sort of act. It's usually signs of affection, signs of love, signs of sex, that kind of stuff, that I'm really drawn to, because ultimately it's about, for me, it highlights the functionality of the woods, of kind of harboring these acts that are very, very, in a sense, intimate and private, but the woods records them ultimately,
Yeah, I think both of you achieve this sort of act of reverence towards things that maybe, like you said, Danny, that we overlook. And by isolating it in these, is it photograms?
Photogrammetry, photogrammetry. That's the process,
Right. It kind of elevates its status, at least in a kind of visual sense. We would see it, because you talk a lot about like the value of an object or the value of an artwork, or what has value and what doesn't. And I guess isolating it gives it a visual value or something, which is really interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's the way you are able to to review it or re-see it, isn't it? Or, to approach it in a different light because of the way it's been presented. Absolutely.
What I really connect to is that you've been hunting around for these arborgrams, that the process of looking and taking care of what is there and hunting for it in some ways is very much the way I'm looking at trees when I'm working with them, and a real sort of care and seeing what's there, and even if it's going there repeatedly to the same tree.
Yeah, I mean, for both of you, I think there's a real strong kind of archaeological digging for meaning, or for recurring imagery, or for traces, really, in very different ways, but definitely both doing it. And the reverence that you have for trees, Johannes, is just beautiful to watch. It's just so moving and vulnerable. Do you want to talk a bit about the work you did as well for the Treewilder exhibition?
In this exhibition, I did a performance with a group of 8 other people, and we initially I went to the site and hunting for a good place to bring a group of people in. I was in contact with the group, and I'd gone there to some of their rehearsals in the studio. And after while that was happening, I was looking for the site. And rather than focusing on a single tree like I've done in previous projects, I decided it would be much better to, in this instance, work with a group of trees. So that in Barnwell, there's this group of 40 young birch trees that I sort of honed in on and loved the pattern that they took, or the seaming pattern. And I thought it would be a really interesting process for us as a group to explore it, both together and to explore the trees. So there's very much an interaction between us as humans, and the human and tree interaction that was happening in the performance.
Yeah, how was it kind of recording that? Because it was recorded as a video, right?
Correct. Yeah. We had it recorded with 3 different cameras. I tried doing it in a couple of different days, but in the end, trying to integrate those 2 different days was very difficult. And I really wanted for the audience to see the whole length of our time there. So spending time, slowing down, like we did when we were in the performance, slowing down to see what was there. And the audience got the benefit of seeing us as a group, but when we are in the performance, it's a much more intimate surroundings, what is really quite close to you, and that's also how I perceive what the trees are perceiving, that that what is immediately around you or beside you.
Yeah, and there's an element of agency there for every individual performer, and that agency extends to the landscape that surrounds you.
Like a bird that might pop by on the branch and sort of gawk at you from above. Yeah, that's so true. Yeah. I love those magical moments when you discover someone has dropped by, or a bird has dropped by, or you see a snail crawling on it on a branch. Those are real pleasurable moments to discover in the piece.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I really get that, from your work, Johannes, and I think it's this idea of the notion of slowing down. It's really resonates. I think it's something about using your eyes to listen. A
phrase that I love. Yeah.
It's like you say, as soon as you stop and then just wander with your eyes and just be there for the sake of that act of being there, it's amazing how things just start to reveal themselves, isn't it?
Yeah.
When you go without a kind of like an agenda of, I think sometimes the part of the issue with our understanding of what to do in these spaces is that there must always be an action or an activity, that is about sort of moving forwards quite quickly sometimes, such as, running or dog walking or that kind of thing, or riding a bike or something, which is all great, of course, but actually they all involve quite a lot of speed. And one of the things we don't do so well, I think, as people who are going into those spaces is actually just sit, and do nothing and just wait for our eyes to start listening,
I'm also imagining when you come to a space that you're imagining what was there, what had happened in the space, and why that mark was made by the people who made them, kind of thing.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, absolutely, and you really need to do that, and to actually drop all preconceptions of the activities, and just try to kind of like see try to, I guess, get surprised by what you find as well. That's the beauty of it. When you do, I'm surprised by the acts and the amount of beauty and sort of tenderness in certain acts as well. And a lot of the times it's about working with challenging material as well, because we are in a sense preconditioned to view certain types of materials, and that might be marks made on a tree. It might also be other materials, such as an empty drinks can, which is one of the sort of signs that I work with quite a lot, these signifiers, these objects I call signifiers. An empty drinks can, we've been told time and time again, is a piece of litter. So it's it goes in hand with this idea of something that is antisocial. But it took me a while to sort of get past that and say, actually, this is not that. This is something different. This is a sign of a highly social, engaged act. But the fact of the can in the woods doesn't designate a sort of antisocial act. It's just a fallout of an act. And maybe what it does designate is the fact that if you do choose to leave something there in that space, it could be that actually because it's because you feel alienated from the space itself rather than part of it. So I think there's an issue, a social issue, I think, about exclusion and marginalization here in the UK anyway, at least, because that's my experience of it, as an adolescent as well, feeling outside of something. So I think there's kind of this idea of care and of sort of what's the word, where you're sort of looking after something. There's a kind of sense of there's a word for it, but I forgot what it is now anyway. But I think anyway it speaks of sort of different values and different levels of association and feeling privileged, I think, to be in a certain space. So yeah, I think again it's about sort of just stopping and trying to sort of leave behind, outside of that space, your own sort of preconceived ideas of a space, I think, as well.
Do you ever get frustrated or mad or angry at things that happen to what's around, like the trees, or that they've destroyed something in some way?
And no, not at all, because I think the amazing thing about that space is it's constantly shifting, it's constantly in flux, and it's constantly healing and repairing itself, and trees are, every time there's a wind, there's a storm, trees fall, other trees grow. And I just actually see the human engagement with that space as of course an extension of this natural environment, very much part of that. That's the word I was looking for, custodians. This idea of kind of custodians of these spaces, I think in its sense can be quite hegemonic as a concept, about sort of power balances. So I think that no matter what activity takes place in these spaces, I don't judge it at all. And if anything, I actually value the activities that for the outset can seem in some way problematic, but ultimately I don't think they are, because they are such fleeting constantly shifting and influx activities, and the woods is fine ultimately, you know. Like a case in point, actually thinking about the aluminium cans, is that often well, I'll photograph them in situ, and then I'll collect them, I'll remove them to be later melted down and then recast into forms that resemble the forest floor with these signifiers, these objects. And when a can has been in that environment for a long period of time, and it will be because it's aluminium, which it doesn't rust, right? So it just sits there for decades. I mean, I found aluminium cans with ring pulls that are really old. I remember from when I was a kid, these really old ring pulls that used to sort of come off altogether. And on the bottom of them, sometimes I found like best before 1988, that sort of stuff, you know, on the bottom of them. But when you get ones that have been there a long time, they miraculously become full of mud. And I thought of the time, well, maybe that's something to do with, you know, just a sort of transition of rain and dust and stuff. But actually, when I cut them open so that I can get the mud out, I noticed that they've been turned into kind of mini habitats for things like slugs and, you know, worms and things. So I guess they bring that stuff in there and make the cans into these small habitats. So again, it's about this idea that, you know, we tend to value stuff from the outside without really engaging with the object itself, you know. And if that object becomes part of a habitat, then for me, it's become part of the woods, you know. That's the thing, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You've almost inspired me, you know, to reevaluate or to be in a space like that and work with what's there, and rather than almost a romantic notion of that I might have of a tree, you know, like a thing, a force of nature kind of thing. Not that I have that always, and there are certain elements of a tree, like the one I was working with in Cuba, that actually was irritating the skin if you touched it in a certain way, right. which was a really interesting discovery. And then when I edited the video, I noticed everyone sort of itching themselves. But yeah, no, I really, it would be an interesting project to go to a space and with a group of people and think about what's left behind after various after an encounter or something like that, or what you discover.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's you know the sort of basis of practices such as archaeology, isn't it? And, you know, ethnography and everything around material culture. It's about, you know, it's about looking at the stuff of our lives. And I think it also, I don't know how you feel about this, but for me, you know, the idea of a space such as the woods being fully utilized and fully used frequently is really great, right? Because we want woods to be frequented and visited, so they don't become these desolate sort of no-go zones. You know, the more people are in there, the better. And for me, this type of usage of the woods or the forest, however you want to frame it, is really valid and is an active community, right? You know, like if you're going to a space and it happens to be the woods, to get high or to hang out with people or to engage in sex, that is just as, for me, just as valid as the rest of this idea of a community of wood goers who might sit there watching birds through binoculars. It's the same kind of usage of space. It's about valuing a space for its inherent properties, really, you know.
funny you sort of provoked the question.
Yeah, just to get your perspective, on the idea of the usage of a space and kind of different levels of value placed on the different levels, the different forms of interaction and engagement in a space such as a wood or forest. I think it'd be interesting to hear your perspective, because I think from my sort of my preconceptions of how a Canadian might sort of view the woods, and also how somebody from the UK versus somebody from like Sweden, for example. I mean, it's like this, we grow up with different associations, and I think that that cultural kind of heritage of how we view a space might then inform how we engage with it as an artist, and also then how we invite engagements from other people, or how we value engagements by other people. I think
what really struck me when I was in the UK is that a lot of the woodlands around Corby and probably as other places as well are private and were like private woodlots from very wealthy people, and it's only through donations and various things like that those woodlands have become more in the public domain through a national trust. So the government has probably had to buy or support the opening of the woodlands. But I also really admired that there's some sort of that you can walk for miles through paths, through woodlots, through private holdings. I forget what you call them there. And I here everything is very much cordoned off. You never walk across a farmer's field. It's never open. It's private property, and if there's hunting going on, they have to go to a special area, which is something that I don't know how that works in England, but where I was, that you saw what do you call it, place where you can sit up in the trees in the canopy and look at what's coming down. And if I'm just imagining hunters coming along and shooting from a hidden spot in amongst the tree canopy. That's sort of a thing that happens there. But it was the public-private thing is much more, I want to say, clearer here than it was there. The boundaries were more fluid, but and yet there was this real what do you call it? Private lands that were that I came across, like Barnwell was at one time owned by somebody who then donated it. Well, even though it was a gravel pit.
Yeah, it's like a sort of post-industrial kind of space, isn't it? Really,
Yeah. And I like the fact that there was care and experimenting going on. I'm sure that the trees that I worked with were planted for some reason that I did not find, was not able to find out, but there was planted very densely for to see what would happen in some point. And now there's also a more movement towards planting native species. So where they do have Canadian maples there, that probably won't be planted in the future. But that's kind of what I'm thinking about. Yeah.
I didn't consider the kind of image of trees in relation to private and public land ownership, because I know I grew up in Ireland, and I mean, so Ireland is like devoid of trees because of colonization, basically. They were all cut down to like stop the Celtic people from hiding and starting rebellions and stuff, and that affected like wolves in Ireland, and then wolves became extinct because it was easier to hunt them. And I never really thought about it that way before. In relation to,
even in public parks, the trees are usually the lower limbs are always removed so that people can see through the woodlands, so that people can't hide in amongst them, generally speaking.
Really?
Yeah. I know that here in Canada, there's especially city parks, to prevent exactly what Danny's been talking about, the drinking, the sex, and all that kind of thing. So if you remove the lower branches of a thing, you can see what's happening underneath them.
Right.
So it's almost like curating a woodland space to stop actions from happening, like specific actions.
Yeah.
That's so strange.
Yeah. And that's interesting because there's a few spaces that I know quite local to me that are part of a forest, but they're the sort of scraggy kind of edges of the forest where there's not dense thick woodland, but there's very kind of like sporadic trees, but it's mostly populated by very dense huge holly bushes. And the holly bushes, obviously, very sort of like hard to access, but there's paths that go through them, and they sort of lead to these tiny cul-de-sacs, usually by the base of a tree, but they're very dense areas. I love them, very fascinating little spaces, because you walk through the paths of the holly bushes, you can't see, it's very easy to lose your way and get a bit lost, and then you come out to this little space in a really, really dense area where the sex takes place, basically. So it's very much that the holly facilitates, again, the act of these different individuals. And this space happens to be one of the largest, colloquially known as like a cruising ground, in London, basically. And I was kind of there. I've been there lots of times, but I was there with a group of men who routinely cruise there, and they were saying that they think it's been there for like 200 years at least. This space, it's really, really interesting, and it's a very, very sort of interesting, again, this kind of like sort of community, basically. But I think, again, it's very active because and much more so over the last 2 years, because COVID was responsible for kind of like closing down quite a lot of spaces. And so these woods have been much more like frequented by this community, utilizing this space, basically. So it's really interesting how different. What I love about the woods is that how different types of woodland will facilitate different types of activities. Which I think is great. It's amazing how that it can do that. It can almost like encourage the different types of activity in certain spaces.
When I get into one of those areas where the tree is surrounding you and you're in the core of the tree and it's all hanging around, it's almost like a blanket that's giving you a warm wrap, and I can see how it would make you comfortable or
totally
to do yes.
Absolutely, yeah. It's interesting you should say that, because it just reminded me of a conversation I had with one of these men who I was kind of like, spent quite a lot of time just kind of having conversations and just getting perspective on this space. And he said that that area of woods reminded him of a club, like a nightclub, because you walk off the road, through the woods, and it gets progressively sort of darker, and then it gets, the path gets tighter as you go in. And he said once you go in there, it's like entering a nightclub. And particularly when you leave that space again, it's a bit like that experience of leaving a club at, like, say, dawn, when the sun's coming up. You walk out into the light and you're blinking, and it's like a totally removed experience. And the light really, really helps to give that sense of difference, so the darkness inside the forest and then the light outside gives us a different sense of time, and of course then it informs the activity as well, just as a club does, as a club's been designed with lighting in a certain way. Just like this natural environment is a similar space, which is really interesting,
And Danny, you also spoke about the works you made, like leaving them intentionally vulnerable to see how people would react. So what kind of findings did you get from that?
It was really, really interesting, actually. I can't remember if I mentioned it, but maybe I did in passing last week. So yeah, that was really something that I wanted to try out for this exhibition, and Fermynwoods were really supportive of this. So, ideas of vulnerability, precarity, being in a sort of precarious state, and fragility are very, very resonate throughout my work, and invisibility as well. So I wanted to kind of just put the works out there, and as I said before, the work was made as a result of interacting with that space. And one of the pieces I made was made kind of like in conjunction with the rangers who work at Barnwell. So on an ongoing project, for different objects I'm working with that reflect the different activities in the woods. One of them are burnt out motorbikes, and again, it kind of like comes back to this idea of value. And usually these burnt out motorbikes are hugely devalued and seen as a problem. But the act that leads them to be left there is in itself called joyriding, right? So the reason it's called joyriding, I imagine, is because it's a great deal of fun, and it's really it gives people joy to do it. And although it's like I totally accept it's illegal, and it's illicit, but that does not mean it has to be necessarily absolutely devalued, and judged in that way. I think it still indicates a community outside of our spectrum of what we value, and a usage of the woods that is outside our spectrum of value as well. And again, it's something that I was familiar with growing up as a adolescent. Never actually stealing and setting fire to motorbikes, just driving them around the woods in a really fun way, when I was younger. But so what I did as a response to the Barnwell woods was bring in sections of a burnt out motorbike that I'd found in woods close to me, and was to get access and to work with the staff, the rangers on the site, in their yearly burnings of the vegetation that grows in Barnwell. So they cut it all back at a certain time of year, just around autumn time, and then they burn it all to get rid of it. So I thought, well, this would be a great way to think about the connection between burning and a sense of obviously the fire and transformation, and ultimately using it as a kind of a bit of a furnace to melt this motorbike. So I kind of did that, and it worked out really well. It turned into this big sort of molten lump of aluminium, and I then started to work with a branch that I came across and kind of positioned it so it looked a bit like a sort of ceremonial kind of staff, something that I wanted to think about the ideas of ceremonies and rituals and burning and all of this stuff that we're very familiar with in terms of mythologies and rituals around things such as the fire and of course the seasons and woodland and that sort of thing. So I wanted to kind of like make a contemporary response to that using the motorbike. So I did that, and I just like put it in situ in the space as for the exhibition opening. And then about 2 weeks ago, I think it was, I got an email saying from James saying, just sorry to let you know that the staff has been like snapped off and it's disappeared. And I was like, okay, well, at first, you're thinking, oh, it's a shame. And he said there was James, the Fermynwoods director, said it's been snapped off, and we think it was an act of vandalism. The only thing that we can find as sort of proof of this are some cans of Stella. And I was like, oh, Stella, it's got to be the Stella that was the cause of it, because for those of you who are not familiar, Stella Artois is a Belgian beer, and it has a bit of a reputation for being a bit of a beer that gets you a bit angry, so so I was like, yeah, totally.
I didn't know it could have that effect.
Oh, totally. Stella's like fighting beer, basically, So,
wow.
But it kind of dawned on me that this is like a perfect response to my work, in that the work's disappeared. It's been, totally destroyed, and what's been left are some like cans and bottles. And it's just like remarkable that I work with cans and bottles as well. And I'm kind of like trying to sort of respond in a way to these sort of semi kind of like violent but still very valuable acts. And it's a great response, I thought. And actually, for me, it says a lot about ideas of exclusion. You know, when we talk about site-specific work, and we talk about, you know, exhibitions that are for the public and are located in a public space, that's all very well, but there's still, I think, a problem with that, because there are still many people who feel outside of that, and they feel excluded from this, I think, and maybe alienated as well. And so I think that was evidence of the alienation, probably, in the destruction of those pieces. So for me, it was kind of like a perfect, quite beautiful thing, you know, for the work to be so vulnerable that it actually disappears and it gets reconsumed back into that sort of dialogue, really. You know, it becomes like joy-ridden in itself again, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You know? And I love it, actually. I love that. I only wish that I'd kind of like taken some sort of like documentary pictures of it beforehand, you know, but I didn't. But I asked James to send me the or to collect the cans of Stella for me, and I'll reuse them as a sort of response to that response, basically, you know.
The sculpture itself was made of aluminium, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
it's like they gave you aluminium in return for
Yeah,
aluminium.
Exactly. They gave,
it was
like,
really transactional.
Yeah, it was like a sort of like beautiful poetic transaction. Here's some aluminium for your aluminium, basically, you know.
Yeah.
What I really liked about the object itself was its free-formedness, the way that it was transformed by the fire, or formed by the fire, not transformed, or is it? I don't transformed, yeah. And that it had it wasn't a liquid state, or I saw it in a liquid state moving to the solid, and I thought that was so beautiful, that the transformation of that metal, and that it had in the end a very private a presence being on that staff.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something you know, very, very seductive about that material in itself, and just for me, again, it's about the availability of it. You know, it's there's so much of it around. Obviously, it can be sometimes in the form of a drinks can, aluminium, but it can be just in, like, you know, motorbike parts, or it just sits there as well in the environment. It doesn't rust or decay, so it's always there. It's always present, and it's a material that's naturally present, of course, in the earth anyway. It's one of the most sort of, you know, hard. It's very hard to get it out of the earth, but it's there in lots of it. And I love this idea of it kind of like returning to that state as well, you know. And you were there, Johannes, weren't you? Of course, in that burning sort of ritual as well. And it was a bit like that for those of you who weren't there. It was a bit like the scene in, like, the end of Terminator 2, I think, where Arnie, like, turns into a big blob of metal at the end. It's a bit like that, you know?
That kind of description of metal as having this constant malleability and flux and state is because I know, Johannes, you're interested in what you described as kind of the sentience of water, which I'd be really curious to talk about, kind of in relation to Danny speaking about fire. It seems like a kind of beautiful elemental conversation.
The sentience is something that I've been thinking about and figuring out what the raw element, and I'm now beginning to like the idea that, or referring to it, that water has a life force, that it has a presence, that it moves on its own, that it has that it's not passive, that it is an active participant in the natural world. I'm reading now. Sorry for this.
No.
Has its own unique qualities, behaviors, and even intelligence. Now, the intelligence is where I'm sort of beginning to think about a lot. not not that it closes the conversation, but it's a way for me to think, okay, how is this water doing, or what is it doing, and why is it doing what it's doing? If I put it in a situation, am I responsible for its actions, dropping it, letting it flow, letting water meld into things, which is what I was thinking about with Danny's aluminum, is the aluminum picking up substances like the earth and the trees and the branches and all of the litter or that's around when the fire is burning, ashes.
Yeah.
I like that trace thing, you know. That's why I sometimes can get so absorbed by the way water bleeds into cloth or bleeds into the ground, or if you drop a bowl of water, the way it rolls out. But it's again referring back to those little details of taking the time to look at something and trying to understand what's happening and being open to what's there, and not trying to close it up with a final answer. That having an open answer is food for fodder for to move to the next thing, or to explore it even deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating, and I think it kind of comes back to what we were talking about before about vulnerability. I think it sounds like, you know, Johannes, what you're talking about is being vulnerable yourself as well, you know, like being vulnerable to something in order to allow it to present itself to you in a different way, you know, in a way that it maybe is new or exceeds our expectation. And I don't know if, Johannes, you've ever come across a book called Vibrant Matter. It's
I haven't.
It's a fascinating book by Jane Bennett, and it's called Vibrant Matter: A Political Ecology of Things. And in it, wow, she talks about the agency of things, and it was really amazing to think about, you know, how an innate object can have agency. And she uses like lots of case studies to show how, you know, the problem that we you know usually sort of enact as humans is that we assume, you know, that we're the agents and everything else is sort of like something that we shape or bend to our will. But actually what she starts to present is the world of things, and we are just, of course, one of those things, and everything has its own agency. We just need to shut up and listen and start to see it, you know.
Yes.
And it's it's amazing, actually, you know. And the book, she talks a bit about this this realization that she had when she understood that this was like a kind of something that she could look into further, you know. And obviously this is like a, you know, this is like a PhD sort of, you know, level book, but it's really, really accessible. It's really fascinating. She talks about like, I think it's in the US, this story. She's standing maybe like outside a coffee shop or something, waiting for something. And I think it's maybe there's a gutter, you know, in the street, and she's looking at and noticing the coming together of the different aspects of things in a gutter, such as like a rubber glove, like a dead rat, something else like a bottle top, and just kind of like, you know, like going into this idea that these things coming together, this like sort of juxtaposition, is this interestingly is a sort of sense of something happening that is outside, you know, and they become agents in their own self, because the result of them coming together, you know, creates something different. And it's you know, there is something in that, I think, that's really interesting when you think about the sort of politics of that, how we place value on stuff and how we, you know, tend to sort of dismiss stuff, or like, you know, that of course goes back to ideas of waste and the abject and all of that sort of stuff. But I think it also goes into natural forms as well, such as, you know, such as water, and the fact that, of course, within the water there are trillions of life forms, right? That sort of thing, you know. It's all about that as well, you know.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I also really like that, and want to come back to the idea of being open to what's there. Being open to looking at the gutter and seeing how the things are interacting, how water is moving things, or how the rubber glove is interacting with the water. I also, for me, being open is also when I'm performing or myself or performing with other people, being open to what's happening, letting it be, and even if there's awkwardness or strange moments, that's part of a human reaction. It's a part of an awkward thing. If a branch should break while I'm sitting on it, that becomes part of the piece. It's how the tree is reacting to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I totally get that.
Yeah. Johannes, I'm curious, how much do you think about the kind of role of the spectator when you're kind of trying to come up with a piece, if you know that there's going to be an audience?
I'm more and more becoming aware of incorporating things that the audience might do. Strange incidences have happened to me during a performance where an audience would interact with me in an unexpected way, and I missed the opportunity to take advantage of what that was, and saw it as an interruption rather than being part of the piece. So I'm now in my Cuban piece, this was very much the case of where the audience became, I want to say, we were seduced them into becoming active participants, because I personally don't like having a performer say, here, do something with this, that's not voluntary anymore. So that we slowly worked our way, that we created paths and interactions, and in the same way when I'm working with other performers, that it's through example, and even if someone isn't doing what I expect, they are doing what they think is right, and that the contrast between us is a beautiful way of interpreting how we should move in that situation. I
read on your website someone described you as like a social anchor for these instances, and I thought that was a lovely way of putting it. And it keeps coming back to that idea of intimacy and community, doesn't it?
Totally.
I do like structuring something, having a score for a piece that people can move within, but also having some kind of structure is also an anchor. And you move around that. If the tree is the anchor, that's one kind of anchor. If it's the leaves and the branches and the noise of the sound, whatever, there are certain guidelines that we moved. For the piece in Barnwell, there was a path through the trees that was quite noticeable, and I took that path as one of the guidelines for the performers to work with. I did this fast and slow movement on either side of the path, and it gave structure to what we were doing, even though it might not be immediately evident to the audience. But it also, after the performance was finished, the audience was very focused on the woodlands after we had moved out of them, which I really liked and appreciated, and it going from the video to that woodlot and discovering that woodlot would have sort of certain echoes to it, which I really liked about the Barnwell presentation.
Yeah. I often think that in the woods you kind of come across these clearings that are almost like theatrical spaces, or like natural amphitheaters. Sometimes it seems like these kind of rounded, especially noticed that in your Cuban piece when the other performer is kind of surrounded by this little kind of U shape of tree, like weird hanging, like that tree is fascinating, by the way. It's so many limbs.
Air roots, so they're roots that come from up above and then root themselves down in, and it supports that long limb in that tree. Yeah,
and even thinking of paths that you were talking about, just the way like animals naturally create pathways in woodland spaces. And all animals use them, us included, you know. My mum's garden has this, like, she keeps her grass really long, and the cats have created this beautiful little path up to where she hangs the laundry, so she follows it as well, and it's really nice that the three of them just go up this path.
Yeah.
There's a design, I think, like a kind of like a design term that usually around public spaces and public architecture design, called desire paths. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
I can imagine what it is.
Yeah, well, it's, you know, like it's a really interesting concept, actually. It's similar to like the kind of like paths that animals use. You know, getting somewhere by the sort of most convenient or the sort of way that makes sense. So you know, like say if you're planning as a public sort of designer, if you're planning, let's say, a park space, rather than putting like a path in a certain area that you think would be makes most sense, sometimes they'll leave the space without that path for a while, and then the members of the public will kind of like cut across a space in a certain way and make these paths that are called desire paths, and then the actual path will follow you know, that mark that's made by the people as they make their ways across the space in different shapes and forms, you see. So desire paths, it's a good name, good term, I think.
Yeah
it is a good name.
It's sometimes things are just designed too much for aesthetic reasons and not for practical reasons, because the designer didn't know where the local grocery store was, and therefore it's on the other side of that angle that
absolutely. Like you know, again, that goes into the ideas of, you know, the kind of woodland being designed to look, you know, for aesthetics, you know. It's interesting how different cultures across the world, their perception of you know, nature and what nature is for, and how to manage and maintain woodland as well, you know, changes massively from different sort of country to country, and it goes into sometimes very, very sort of tight control and manicuring of the actual space itself, you know. But now, as you mentioned before, Johannes, we're getting into a stage now of actually thinking about maybe allowing the woods to just do what it does without being too enforced by our own sort of hands, as it were, you know.
That's what's interesting with those birches that we worked with in Barnwell, is that someone had tried to plan it out in a very in rows for and I don't know how they came up with the final plan, or if it was more random than I imagine it, but also that it was so dense that some of the trees are stronger than others, that some of them are thicker, even though they were all planted at the same time. There are some that look older, just because of the canopy room in the canopy they take. So it's, again, nature taking its own path towards the sky, shall we say, finding its own, that those trees are cooperating amongst themselves on who shall live and who shall die, kind of thing. I don't mean to be so dramatic about that, but
that's what it is, isn't it? It's, you know, it's a kind of like constant battleground in that space, basically. You know, everything is fighting for the light, you know.
But maybe the young ones are just holding back until there's an opening, and that they're still around and hanging, and so that in some ways maybe there's less of a competition or struggle, that the bigger older ones are supporting the younger ones for the time being until there is room, kind of thing. There's different ways of perceiving that as well.
Yeah, and it's amazing how much more information and knowledge is being understood recently, with the kind of like the whole symbiotic relationship, between trees and between, of course, like, fungi as well, and it's like a lot of research obviously has gone into that, but it's a fascinating area, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm now reading a book called Arbonauts, like astronauts, but arbonauts that are exploring the canopy of the tree.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. It's she's I forget where she's from the US in the New York region, and then goes down to Australia and does her most of her education and lives there for 17 years. But it's also like making this contraption so she can get up into the canopy of the tree. And she was one of the first people that really started counting on what is up there, rather than what falls down to the ground, which is the way of making senses of one kind of or another. But yeah, I'm not finished the book yet, but it's a really interesting idea that I love the term too, arbonauts. Discovering something.
Yeah.
Not enough sci-fi takes place in the woods, I think.
Yeah, right. That's exactly it. Yeah.
That actually made me think of a book, Danny, that I think you would like. You might have read it already. Have you heard of Infidel Poetics by Daniel?
No, never. Infidel Poetics.
Yeah, it talks about riddles, nightlife, and substance, and the kind of the nocturnal, and it's mostly about kind of lyric obscurity and how maybe working class kind of vernacular can influence the lived lives of these kind of invisible communities or subterranean or underground communities. I just thought maybe it might be relevant to your research. Yeah, it's a really fascinating read.
Right. It sounds fascinating. Yeah.
We should have a book list as an
compendium to this. Totally, because when you were saying that, actually, I started thinking there's a great book called A Mushroom at the End of the World. I don't know if you've ever heard of that one.
Yes.
Because that again, the idea of hidden communities who kind of thrive in particularly in sort of like post-industrial woodlands and things like that, like on the looking at the sort of west coast of the US as well, in particular, and communities from many different places, usually based on sort of migration and of course, migrating for work as well. It's a fascinating book, really,
I also I like the some of the communities that you were talking about, like the Vietnamese community, and then the soldiers that what do you call it? Ex-soldiers. I don't know how they're referred to.
Is it veterans?
Yes, veterans. That's the word. Yeah, the veterans that are also struggling, but they're also a group of veterans hunting for mushrooms in the same way. Yeah.
And the thing that I think is really fascinating about that in particular is that it's not a romantic book at all. It's very much it looks at the fact that the veterans would be perhaps suspicious of the Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese might be suspicious of the Cambodians, for example, who also operate in a sort of similar space. So what's really, I think, really great about that book is that you start to understand that you can actually be a community who use a space, even if you don't share the same values, or you're kind of slightly suspicious, or you've got no interest in another group of people. It's still, you are still a community of foragers, for example, for mushrooms. Because I think we tend to have this kind of like this sort of very romanticized contemporary idea of what a community looks like, and I think that's the great thing about that book is that it sort of totally shatters this idea that it's all about sort of getting along and everything's great. It's actually sometimes these are based on kind of tiny minor conflicts that need to be resolved and stuff, but it still nevertheless shows that there's a community, or what in the widest sense, that thrives in these spaces, and it shares this kind of sense of invisibility or being disenfranchised or totally marginalized, by, for example, Vietnam veterans and the US government, this kind of thing. It's an amazing, so it's an amazing sort of obviously it's like an anthropological study. It's an amazing study on contemporary life and living in a space such as the US, which has got very, very harsh policies in terms of welfare and looking after people as well. So these people are literally driven into the woods to find sustenance and to find a way of life, because there's nowhere else to go, basically. So again, I think it's an amazingly starkly sort of sobering book about ideas of communities. A bit like that film Nomadland. I don't know if you've seen that film.
Yes, I have.
That's quite interesting as well, about the idea of having to sort of contemporary sort of migration for work, where you might be working in an Amazon warehouse on a seasonal basis. A bit like you get the ideas of kind of like fruit pickers or something like that, from the sort of like 1920s or something, or working on farmland or something. And now it's like these spaces are kind of like Amazon sort of delivery centers and stuff like that, as well. So yeah, it's a really, really good film, actually.
But it's also not a case where it's all bad or all good. That the people in no man land do. There's a certain that they don't want a steady job, or that they like traveling, or that they don't want to be tied down to certain things. Just like there can be a certain romance about trees, but again, it isn't all flowers and perfume for trees either. That there's competition, that there is, but there's also like there's competition, there's also cooperation, and how and when that happens, and is a wide spectrum as far as I can like to look at it, and absolutely. Finding those details, and finding the research, doing the research on a particular tree or a particular location is enriching for the performers, for the performance. Now, whether the audience sees that is I think beside the point. Just like if for the audience member coming across the aluminum that was melted, whether they understand what's there, they just might see a hunk of metal, but that's not the point in my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right.
Yeah, I don't think it would make sense for the work to be black and white in that sense. No. There has to be that ambiguity or liminality for you to really be able to engage with it.
Going back to that word openness, that there leads a conversation that can be had about a piece of work, that it's not that it's not too defined, because otherwise, if it's too defined, it comes back to another word. What was it? Didactic. If a piece is too didactic, then it stops you, and it stops you from interpreting what a piece might mean.
Yeah. And if a work is didactic, it kind of becomes hierarchical, which both of you are trying extremely for that not to be the case.
Yeah, absolutely, totally.
Which you both achieve, I should say.
Yeah, that's good to hear.
For me, the one thing that I wouldn't mind sort of reiterating is the idea of joy and pleasure that I think is in both of our pieces, and in different ways. Mine is more of an immediate, that the audience sees the joy that we are getting out of that piece. Yours is a more I might be mistaken, but is more of a hidden joy that gets translated.
Yeah, I think so. I think the thing that for me, unites them is this idea of a shared joy. A joy between participants. Like regardless of when that happens, at what time of the day or night. I think it's about this kind of like shared shared experience in a space that itself is remarkable because it has no limits to that. It enables the joy. It's what I'm looking for, that word. It enables it to happen. And I don't know how, for you, Johannes, but for me, as I see it, what's remarkable about the woods is that because of the nature of woods, not nature itself, nothing to do with that big capital N word, but the nature of the woods or woodland enables a particular type of act to happen that there's nowhere else that it would happen or it can happen. Because of the fact it's happening there, right? So it's about choosing subconsciously or consciously choosing that space for the action to take place, because that is a space that is either secluded or kind of private or non sort of judgmental or non-hierarchical, or you're not being observed. There's no CCTV cameras watching you, there's no passers-by. It's kind of like a private yet public space, and it's that sort of mix of private and public and intimate and open, which I think is a remarkable about the woodland. You can be in the middle of the woods and you can be totally undressed, but you can still feel covered, shrouded by bushes, for example. You still feel kind of like safe and secure in that space.
Have you heard of the term forest bathing?
Yeah, it's like a Japanese thing. Is it Japanese thing?
Yeah. It's where it sort of originated. But when you're talking about getting naked and you're covered by the woods themselves, that's one idea that immediately came to my mind. That there's a comfort. Again, I was referring to a blanket earlier. That you're enveloped by the forest in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're so right. Yeah, that and for me, that's the thing about vulnerability, but about the space itself and shared joy, as you were talking about, Johannes. It's about this collective joy and the understanding that there are others who, regardless of what your motivation is for being in that space, there are others who will also be there for a similar sort of motivation. And of course, that's something that you encourage and enact in your works as well. That participation. And that's the thing that's for me is the joyous act, is understanding that you are part of something, even if the other participants aren't even aware of your existence. That's the thing that, again, the things that I'm looking for in my work are shared values around certain objects that are left as part of the kind of like fallout of activities, which indicates a connection to me, even across different times and different spaces. So so it's again it's that collective joy idea, isn't it?
Yeah. Totally.
I don't think we talk about joy enough, especially in art. So it's really refreshing to instead of thinking about climate emergency or there's so much worry on everyone's and anxiety on everyone's mind all the time. It's nice to kind of look at it from a different angle, from a different perspective, and to see the shared and collective joy that emerges in these spaces. It's really lovely.
That's one thing that the Cubans really reminded me of. I was constantly thinking about their struggles with the economy and the lack of food, or the fact that there's no eggs, no meat, and that kind of thing, the price of the dollar. And I was asking them to do something when they could be trying to provide or hunt or stand in line for something, that art provided them a release from that, a joy, an escape, and that it was something that they could consume themselves in, that took them away from their day-to-day.
You can find more from Danny and Johannes and the rest of the artists who made work as part of Treewilder on our website. The exhibition runs until the 28th of February 2023. Listeners on Spotify are also able to experience an accompanying video to this episode by artist Sapphire Goss. And for listeners on other platforms, you can find Sapphire's work on our website. Links to all of this are in the episode description, as always. Sapphire Goss is a multidisciplinary artist who works with moving image, photography, and other lens-based methods. Using obsolete technology, she creates chimerical imagery using unexpected materials, looping and processing to make an analog uncanny, grainy, shimmering, otherworldly bursts of light and emotion, both moving and mysterious. A wonderful accompaniment to this audio work. This episode has been edited by Astrid Bjo, the other half of SUBTERRA. Thank you for listening to the Fermynwoods Contemporary Art Podcast. If you enjoy our podcast, please make sure to positively rate, review, and subscribe on your podcatcher. It helps other people find the podcast, and it makes us feel good about ourselves. This podcast series is part of Xylophobia, Fermynwoods Contemporary Art's new 2-year programme funded by Arts Council England. Visit fermynwoods.org for more information on our programme and to sign up to our monthly email newsletter. Follow us at Fermynwoods on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and make sure to check out SUBTERRA at Subterrestrials on Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. Hope to see you back here soon.